The story of Sarah Collins. She was to her own children both mother and sister. From Kentucky's isolated hills comes the most impure story. Deep in the remote, eastern Kentucky hollows, where roads seldom ventured beyond one's own property line and the mist clings to ancient mountains, a family existed whose bloodline became so tangled that the natural order itself was defied. This is the story of Sarah Collins, a woman who bore the unimaginable burden of being both sister and mother to her own children. A legacy culminating in one of the most disturbing cases of consanguinity ever documented in America's rural history, generations of familial unions and isolation. The year was 1937. A world apart. While America's rest struggled through the Great Depression, a world almost entirely their own existed for the isolated communities of eastern Kentucky's Cumberland Plateau. Tucked away in a hollow between jagged ridges, only accessible by a winding dirt road that became impassable after heavy rains, the Collins family had lived for over a century. They rarely welcomed outsiders into their fold or ventured beyond their mountain haven. In the 1830s, the Collins clan settled in these hills when Jacob Collins, a rumored fugitive from Pennsylvania, sought refuge in the most remote corner of Kentucky he could find. The isolation, which initially provided safety, soon became a way of life. As generations passed, the family remained largely cut off from the broader society, relying on themselves for survival, for companionship, and eventually for continuing their bloodline. By the 1900s, occupying several adjacent properties, the Collins family formed a secluded community of their own. Their isolation was not just geographical, it was also reinforced by their unique customs, their own suspicion of outsiders, and eventually by the whispered rumors that kept neighboring communities at a distance. The outside world had little to offer the Collins family, and for its intrusion, they in turn had little desire. James Collins, Sarah's father, inherited a small timber operation from his own father in the early 1920s. From their extensive mountain property, the family cut lumber, occasionally trading with nearby settlements when necessary. Following a pattern established over several generations, James had married his first cousin, Martha. The compounded toll. Their union produced 5 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood, with Sarah being the middle child, born in 1919. In the Collins bloodline, the physical toll of generations of familial unions was becoming increasingly apparent. Her uncle was also Martha's father, and similar connections riddled their family tree. The children exhibited distinctive facial features, close-set eyes, unusually disproportionate facial structures, and a noticeable intellectual impairment in Sarah's case that left her childlike even as she physically matured into adulthood. The devastating pattern continued when Sarah turned 16. Following what had become a disturbing family tradition, her father, James, took his own daughter as his partner after Martha's death during a harsh winter in 1935. This union, which the family kept hidden from the already limited outside contact they maintained, would produce children who were simultaneously her offspring and her siblings, a biological tangle that reflected the increasingly knotted Collins family tree. Dr. Harold Marshfield, a newly graduated physician assigned to the Rural Health Initiative in eastern Kentucky, first encountered the Collins family in 1943. What I discovered in that remote hollow challenges everything we understand about family structure and the consequences of isolation, he would later write in his journals. Discovery and genetic decline. The genetic decline was immediately apparent, but what truly disturbed me was the social structure that enabled it. Generations of separation from societal norms had created an entirely different understanding of familial relationships. The isolation of families like the Collins wasn't entirely unique in Appalachia during this period. Throughout the Cumberland Plateau, extremely isolated communities were created by the challenging terrain and limited infrastructure. Transportation networks developed slowly in these rugged regions, and many people lived in what anthropologists would later term closed communities with minimal outgoing or incoming migration. While consanguineous relationships weren't as widespread as outside stereotypes suggested, the Collins family represented an extreme case where generations of such practices had continued uninterrupted. By the time authorities became aware of the situation in 1943, 3 children had been born to Sarah, fathered by her own father. These children, her half-siblings and offspring, showed severe developmental issues. The eldest, a 7-year-old boy, could barely speak and exhibited physical deformities that reflected the compounded genetic issues from generations of consanguinity. More severe intellectual disabilities appeared in the middle child, a 5-year-old girl, while the youngest, just 2 years old, already showed signs of developmental delays. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel to learn the shocking truth about America's most isolated communities. How decades of seclusion can transform normal family structures into something unrecognizable is revealed by the Collins family's story. Subscribe now to ensure you don't miss the next chapter, where we reveal the community's shocking reaction and how authorities discovered this hidden family. Piercing the veil of isolation. The discovery of the Collins family's situation came through a series of coincidences that finally pierced their isolation's veil. In the early 1940s, the first outsider to glimpse the reality of the Collins Hollow was Thomas Jenkins, a forestry surveyor mapping timber resources for the war effort in 1942. Jenkins stumbled upon the Collins property while seeking help after his truck broke down. The place seemed frozen in time, Jenkins later reported to authorities. "I noticed immediately that something wasn't right about the people there. The woman, Sarah, had the demeanor of a child, though she had children of her own clinging to her skirts. Deeply suspicious of my presence, the older man, who I later learned was both the father of her children and her father, quickly sent me on my way. But what I saw in those few minutes haunted me enough to report it to the county health office." Jenkins' report initially gathered dust. Resources were stretched thin during wartime, and remote mountain families weren't a priority. However, the following year, when Dr. Marshfield took his position as part of a rural health initiative, he followed up on several concerning reports, including Jenkins' account of the Collins family. Unraveling the lineage. What Marshfield discovered upon reaching the Collins Hollow was a family lineage so intertwined that it resembled a circular pattern rather than the branching tree of normal genealogy. Using county records and information from neighboring communities, he began to piece together the Collins family history, revealing multiple generations of first-cousin marriages, uncle-niece unions, and finally, the father-daughter relationship that produced Sarah's 3 children. In the Collins lineage, the degree of consanguinity exceeded anything documented in modern medical literature. Classic signs of genetic decline, progressive intellectual disability, characteristic facial abnormalities, reduced fertility among some members, and increased susceptibility to recessive genetic disorders were exhibited by the family, Marshfield noted in his private journal. The most severe manifestations were shown by the youngest generation, born of a father-daughter union that followed several previous generations of close interbreeding. Among medical professionals who later studied Marshfield's documentation, the physical appearance of the Collins children became one of the most discussed aspects of the case. Unusually small heads, prominent brow ridges, misaligned teeth, and asymmetrical facial features were displayed by the children. Their motor skills developed at a fraction of the normal rate, and speech development was severely delayed, or, in the case of the middle child, apparently absent. Isolation and cognitive disconnect. Beyond the physical and cognitive impacts, Marshfield observed behavioral patterns that reflected the unusual family structure and isolation. The children interact as siblings, unaware that their mother is also their sister and that their grandfather is also their father, he wrote. The nature of her relationship to her father seems unable to be fully comprehended by Sarah herself. Having been raised in an environment where such arrangements were normalized over generations, the isolation of this hollow has created not just genetic abnormalities but a complete alternative understanding of family structure. The accumulating impact of generations of consanguinity was revealed by the medical examination of the Collins family. Unusual patterns of recessive gene expression were shown by blood samples, and significant intellectual disabilities throughout the family were confirmed by cognitive testing. Sarah herself functioned at what Marshfield estimated to be the level of an 8-year-old child, despite being in her early 20s, a woman physically capable of motherhood but cognitively unprepared for its responsibilities. An insular world. The isolation that enabled the Collins family situation wasn't merely geographical. Cultural isolation played an equally important role as outside communities gradually modernized and developed through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Collins family remained entrenched in patterns established generations earlier. Without exposure to broader social norms and education, and with increasing genetic factors affecting cognitive development, an insular world with its own rules and structures had been created by the family. When initially confronted by authorities, James Collins displayed no recognition that his relationship with his daughter violated any natural or social law. In his isolated world, where his own parents had been closely related, the progression to a father-daughter union seemed to represent merely a continuation of established family patterns. How thoroughly the family had become detached from mainstream society and its taboos was highlighted by this cognitive disconnect. Long-held suspicions about the Collins family were held by the neighbors in nearby hollows, but they adhered to the mounting code of minding one's own business. "We knew something wasn't right up in that hollow," one local resident told Marshfield. "But mountain folk don't interfere in family matters unless there's clear danger. We didn't realize how far it had gone until your people brought those children down to the county seat." A challenging case. When Marshfield presented his findings to county authorities, the case presented unprecedented challenges. No clear precedent existed for handling such an extreme situation of multi-generational consanguinity. The immediate concern was for the welfare of the children, who clearly required medical attention and developmental support beyond what their isolated hollow could provide. Yet, removing them from the only home they knew presented its own trauma. Particularly difficult questions were posed by Sarah's position in the situation. Functionally a child herself but legally an adult, she was both victim and, in the eyes of some authorities, participant in the family's dysfunctional structure. Marshfield strongly advocated that she be viewed primarily as a victim, a product of generations of isolation and previous consanguineous relationships that had left her without the cognitive capacity to understand or resist the situation she was placed in. The culmination of over a century of progressive isolation is represented by Sarah Collins, Marshfield wrote in his official report. She is simultaneously an effect and a cause of the family's genetic decline. Born of a consanguineous union herself, then bearing children in another such union, all within an isolated environment that normalized these relationships. Her case challenges our medical, legal, and ethical frameworks, requiring us to look beyond judgment to intervention and prevention. The genetic study. By early 1944, beyond the county level, the Collins case had begun to draw attention. State health authorities became involved, and a team of specialists from the University of Kentucky traveled to examine the family and document what was becoming recognized as an extraordinary case study in the effects of prolonged genetic isolation and consanguinity. Dr. Eleanor Ridgway, a geneticist who joined the university team, conducted the most thorough analysis of the Collins family genetics. An almost laboratory-pure example of genetic decline through consanguinity is represented by what we observed in the Collins lineage, she noted in her research. A closed genetic system was created by the family's isolation, where recessive traits became increasingly expressed with each generation. By the time of Sarah's children, a concentration of genetic abnormalities was observed by us that would be virtually impossible in a diverse genetic population. Beyond their obvious developmental delays, the medical examination of the Collins children revealed multiple health concerns. The oldest boy suffered from a heart condition common in cases of recessive gene expression. Seizures that became increasingly frequent as she grew older were experienced by the middle child. While showing fewer physical abnormalities, the youngest demonstrated severe delays in cognitive development that suggested significant neurological impacts. A plea for history. I hope you're feeling what I'm feeling right now, the profound tragedy of this family's situation. If you're as invested in understanding these hidden American histories as I am, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We're uncovering stories that shaped our nation but were hidden from public view for decades. Hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss a single revelation. Difficult decisions regarding the Collins family were faced by the state authorities. Ultimately, James Collins was charged with offenses against his daughter, though the legal framework of the time struggled to address the complex reality of the situation. A transition that proved traumatic despite being necessary for their well-being. Sarah and her children were relocated to a state facility where they could receive appropriate medical care and support. Marshfield documented Sarah's response to the intervention. She appears simultaneously distressed and relieved by the separation from her father. Her emotional attachment to him transcends typical family bonds, reflecting the confused relational boundaries that defined her upbringing. Without apparent recognition of the contradiction this represents, she speaks of him as both father and partner. Adaptation and resilience. Differently to their new environment did the three Collins children respond. The oldest boy, initially withdrawn and fearful, gradually began to engage with caretakers and showed surprising potential for development when provided with appropriate educational support. More challenging proved the middle child's health issues, with her seizure condition requiring ongoing medical intervention. The greatest capacity for adaptation to the new environment was demonstrated by the youngest, removed from the isolated hollow before many patterns had been firmly established. While the Collins case was unfolding, anthropologists began to develop a more nuanced understanding of Appalachian isolation and its effects. Robert Tinnew, whose research would later be published as Night Comes to the Chromosomes, Inbreeding and Population Genetics in Southern Appalachia, was among the first to systematically study marriage patterns in the region. His work would eventually challenge some of the stereotypes about widespread inbreeding while acknowledging that isolated cases like the Collins family did exist. Rather than a regional norm, the Collins case represents an extreme outlier, Tinnew would later write. Conditions that were unusual, even within the context of historically isolated Appalachian communities, were created by their extraordinary level of isolation, geographical, social, and eventually genetic. Through occasional outmarriage and community interaction, most mountain families, while relatively isolated compared to urban populations, maintained sufficient genetic diversity. The Mountain Code. The complex attitudes toward family privacy and autonomy in Appalachian culture were reflected by the broader community's reaction to the Collins case. While simultaneously resenting outside intervention in mountain affairs, many locals expressed horror at the specific situation. "What happened up there wasn't right," one neighbor told researchers. "But we don't much care for government men coming in and telling mountain folk how to live. Most families here keep to themselves, but know the difference between right and wrong for Sarah." The first time she had regularly interacted with people outside her immediate family was marked by the transition to institutional care for Sarah. Caretakers reported that she initially struggled with basic social conventions and seemed confused by the facility's structured routines. Strong remained her attachment to her children, though professionals noted that her interactions sometimes more closely resembled sibling relationships than parent-child bonds, a reflection of her own confused position as both mother and sister. When Sarah plays with her children, an equality to their interactions exists that differs from typical mother-child dynamics, observed Elizabeth Harmon, a social worker assigned to the family. Lacking the natural authority and guidance of a mother figure, she engages with them as peers in many ways. This isn't surprising given her own developmental level and the confused family structure she was raised in. Long-term study. From an immediate intervention, the case gradually transformed into a long-term study in the treatment and effects of severe consanguinity impacts. Medical professionals from across the country consulted on the Collins family, contributing to the evolving understanding of genetic disorders and developmental disabilities. The potential for intervention and support to mitigate the effects of genetic challenges was an important case study provided by the children in particular. A silent testament to the dangers of extreme isolation, in the mountains, the Collins Hollow stood empty. Previously hesitant to discuss the Collins clan, neighboring families gradually began to share stories that revealed signs of concern had existed for generations. "My grandmother used to say there was something not right about how the Collins kept to themselves," one elderly resident recalled. "They stopped coming to community gatherings back in her mother's day. And when they did show up, the children didn't seem right, slow to speak and odd-looking. Folks wondered but didn't pry. That's the mountain way. A history not to be forgotten." When you watch this story and feel the emotion stirring inside you, I want you to leave a comment saying, "This history must not be forgotten." Your comment helps ensure these crucial stories reach more people who need to understand America's hidden past. Type those words now, "This history must not be forgotten," so I know you're with me in preserving these important narratives. By 1950, the Collins case had become an important reference point in medical literature regarding consanguinity and its effects. Valuable longitudinal data on the development and treatment of individuals affected by severe genetic issues resulting from inbreeding was provided by follow-up studies on Sarah and her children. The medical community used the insights gained to improve understanding of genetic counseling and intervention, while protecting the family's privacy by changing names in published materials. Dr. Ridgeway, continuing her research with the family, documented the children's developmental trajectories over several years. The varying capacity for improvement when provided with appropriate support is the remarkable finding in the Collins children, she noted. While all three continue to experience significant limitations, their divergent responses to intervention highlight the complex interplay between environmental influence and genetic factors. Unexpected progress in language development and basic academic skills was shown by the oldest boy, initially given a poor prognosis, though he continued to function well below age-appropriate levels. By age 15, he had achieved functional communication and sufficient self-care skills to suggest the possibility of supported independent living as an adult, an outcome few had predicted when he was first evaluated. Divergent trajectories. More severely impacted remained the middle child's development, complicated by her ongoing seizure disorder. Despite intensive therapeutic intervention, she achieved only limited verbal communication and required continuous supervision. The more profound and resistant effects that could result from compounded genetic issues were illustrated by her case. The most encouraging trajectory was presented by the youngest child, achieving near-appropriate milestones in several developmental areas after 5 years of intervention while still exhibiting some cognitive delays and characteristic physical features that marked his genetic heritage. That early intervention could significantly mitigate some effects of consanguinity was suggested by his progress. Meaningful but limited progress was experienced by Sarah herself. Greater independence in daily living skills was developed by her with consistent support and education, and appropriate social connections within the supportive environment of the state facility were formed. Her cognitive functioning remained at approximately the same level, but markedly improved were her adaptive skills, allowing her to participate more fully in the care of her children within a supervised setting. Lasting impact. The prevention of similar situations was significantly contributed to by the case. More extensive outreach to isolated communities began to be included in public health initiatives in Appalachia, with educational programs addressing the risks of consanguineous relationships. While providing critical health information, these initiatives required careful cultural sensitivity, acknowledging the independence and privacy valued by mountain communities. Dr. Marshfield, who continued to work with rural Appalachian communities throughout his career, reflected on the broader implications of the Collins case. While this family represented an extreme situation, the need for accessible health services and education in isolated regions was highlighted by their story. The most effective prevention isn't external control, but ensuring that even the most remote communities have access to the knowledge and resources needed to make informed decisions. Also evolved was the academic understanding of Appalachian isolation. In the wake of the Collins case and similar studies, researchers recognized that the stereotype of widespread inbreeding in the mountains had been greatly exaggerated, often used to dismiss the region's economic challenges as self-inflicted rather than acknowledging the structural factors that contributed to Appalachian poverty. At the same time, the real impacts of geographical isolation on community health and development were documented by them. The extreme isolation that characterized communities like the Collins Hollow had begun to be reduced by improvements in regional infrastructure, roads, schools, and healthcare facilities by the mid-1950s. The broader society was gradually connected to previously isolated mountain communities by a post-war economic expansion, while unevenly distributed, which brought new opportunities for employment and education. The final years. As they approached adulthood, the 1950s brought transitions for the Collins children. The oldest, now in his late teens, was enrolled in a vocational training program that built on his strengths while accommodating his limitations. Requiring ongoing medical support for her seizure condition, the middle child remained in residential care. The most promising development was shown by the youngest, who was placed with a foster family with the goal of eventual mainstream education with support services. Sarah spent the remainder of her life in institutional care, where she had developed appropriate attachments to caregivers and fellow residents and a stable routine. Her relationship with her children evolved as they grew older and their cognitive development in some cases surpassed her own, a unique dynamic that required careful support from the professionals working with the family. A limited sentence was served by James Collins, reduced in consideration of the cultural context and his own limited understanding of the situation. He chose not to return to the isolated hollow upon release, but instead relocated to a small town in western Kentucky, where he lived quietly until his death in 1962. Whether from legal restriction, personal choice, or some combination remains unclear from the records, he never attempted to contact Sarah or the children again. The Collins Hollow itself gradually returned to wilderness. A silent monument to the dangers of extreme isolation, the abandoned homestead with its weathered cabin and overgrown fields became. Occasionally, local teenagers would venture there on dares, perpetuating whispered stories about the family that had lived there, stories that grew increasingly distorted with each retelling until they bore little resemblance to the actual human tragedy that had unfolded. A legacy of insight. By 1960, from public attention, the Collins case had faded, though it remained an important reference in medical literature. Their privacy protected by institutional policies and changing names, the family members continued their lives away from public scrutiny. Long-term care and support had been transitioned to by the immediate intervention, with the focus shifting from the sensational aspects of the case to the ongoing human needs of the individuals involved. In highlighting both the specific genetic consequences of consanguinity and the broader social factors that could enable such situations, the lasting impact of the Collins case was for medical and social work professionals. The case influenced approaches to outreach in isolated communities and contributed to a more nuanced understanding of the support needed by individuals with genetic disorders and developmental disabilities. As the decades passed, from current event to historical case study gradually transformed the Collins family story. By the 1970s, new generations of medical and social work students encountered the case under pseudonyms as an important example in their textbooks, studying the genetic and social patterns without knowing the real names or specific location of the family involved. Even as their story informed professional practice, their privacy was maintained as the actual individuals continued their lives outside the public eye. Long-term outcomes. A supported community setting was where the oldest Collins child lived most of his adult life, after completing vocational training. Despite his limitations, a level of independence that exceeded early expectations was achieved by him, working in a sheltered workshop and participating in community activities with appropriate support. Having experienced health complications common in individuals with similar genetic backgrounds, he passed away in 1988 at the age of 52. Lifelong care was required by the middle child due to her more severe disabilities and ongoing seizure condition. She lived in specialized residential facilities where the continuous support she needed was provided by dedicated staff despite her limited communication abilities. Small pleasures that enriched a life defined by significant challenges, her responsiveness to music and nature, were noted by caregivers. From complications related to her seizure disorder, she passed away in 1979 at age 41. The highest level of independence was achieved by the youngest child. After successful placement with a foster family and specialized education, sufficient skills were developed by him to live semi-independently as an adult. He married another individual with mild intellectual disabilities whom he met through a supported employment program. A decision informed by genetic counseling regarding the risks associated with his family history, the couple did not have children. He lived until 2010, reaching the age of 69. Institutional settings were where Sarah Collins spent the remainder of her life. Though the nature of those institutions evolved significantly over the decades from the initially restrictive environment of the 1940s, she transitioned through various facilities as approaches to supporting individuals with intellectual disabilities became more focused on dignity, choice, and community integration. Simple joy in crafts, music, and the visits of those who cared for her was found by her, and her childlike perspective was maintained throughout her life. Sarah passed away in 1982 at the age of 63. Modern relevance. Considerably in the decades following the Collins case advanced the medical understanding of consanguinity and its effects. New tools for identifying and managing risks were provided by the development of genetic testing and counseling. However, the fundamental findings from the Collins study regarding the compounding effects of multigenerational consanguinity and the importance of early intervention remained relevant in modern genetic medicine. The social context that enabled the Collins situation changed dramatically over the same period. Increasingly rare became the extreme isolation that characterized their hollow as transportation networks, telecommunications, and economic changes connected previously remote communities to the broader society. While some Appalachian regions continued to face significant challenges related to poverty and access to services, largely a thing of the past became the complete isolation that had sheltered the Collins family from outside influence. Primarily historical had the Collins case become by the early 21st century a reflection of conditions that no longer existed in the same form. Yet, to illustrate the profound consequences of isolation and the complex interplay between environment, genetics, and human development, the human story at its center retained its power. Despite the passing decades, for professionals working in genetics, developmental psychology, and social services, the case continued to offer valuable insights. Dr. Harold Marshfield, who first documented the Collins family situation, continued working in rural health until his retirement in the 1970s. On the case that had defined the early years of his career, he reflected in his final professional publication. A testament to human resilience and adaptability and a tragic consequence of extreme isolation are both represented by the Collins family, he wrote. While their story began in circumstances few of us can imagine, the remarkable capacity for growth that exists even in the most challenging situations was revealed by the response of each family member to intervention and support. The Collins family's hollow eventually became part of a national forest. To all but the most dedicated local historians was lost the exact location of their homestead. The cabin, outbuildings, and small family cemetery, the physical traces of their presence, gradually disappeared beneath the advancing forest, reclaimed by the wilderness from which they had been temporarily carved. A lasting legacy. In academic circles, the Collins case continued to be referenced in discussions of genetic isolation, though always with the appropriate privacy protections. Their story contributed to improved understanding of rare genetic conditions and informed approaches to supporting individuals with similar challenges. In this way, knowledge that benefited many others was ultimately contributed to by a family situation that began in isolation and tragedy. The evolution of